Yes, everyone, thank you so much for joining today. I'm super stoked that I'm here at C Sharp Corner. I think this is my first time here, and I'm absolutely loving the other talks that I've seen so far. The content is amazing, and I think the organizers are doing a really good job. Now, I can introduce myself really quick. My name is Mohammad Ahsan Ayaz, and I'm essentially from Pakistan. I've been in Stockholm for about 2 years now. I have been working in the software industry for about 8 years now, and I'm currently working as a senior software engineer at Klarna, which is one of the Sweden's big startups. And I'm also a Google acknowledged GDE or Google Developers Expert in Angular, just like the other cool speakers that we had. And today we are going to talk about Angular and Cypress and how you can implement blazing fast end-to-end tests with Cypress for your Angular application. And just to point out here that it's not just about Angular. If you have a React application or Vue application, the principles are essentially the same. But here we are going to talk or focus on Angular mainly. So let's talk about what is Cypress. So Cypress is an open source test runner that you can use to run different tests, and it provides you a bunch of tools and ecosystem that is really amazing to integrate within your small or big projects. It doesn't matter. So let's talk about what Cypress helps you with. Cypress helps you with setting up tests, which means that within a few minutes, you should have a complete configuration set up with Cypress, and then you just write the test. You don't have to change anything within your existing code, which is the most amazing part. It just adds on top of your existing application. Cypress also comes with a bunch of tools that you can use to actually write tests. And what's amazing about those tests is that you don't have to learn Angular to write those tests. It comes with a language that is totally easy, an API that you can use to understand how this works, and it's really easy for any developer to get started with. Cypress also helps you with running the test. As I already mentioned, it's a test runner. So it comes with that test runner, and it also contains certain integrations with the popular CI tools. For instance, if you are running in Circle CI or with GitHub Action, Cypress got you covered. Another cool thing about Cypress is that if you want, you can actually record your tests as in videos. For instance, if something fails and you have got a critical error, you can actually get a video out of it. And then you can perhaps send it to your DevOps team or whoever is concerned with the particular test. And then you can trace back to what exactly happened during that. You also get screenshots out of the Cypress test, and I'm going to show you how that works going forward. And one last but not the least thing that about Cypress is that it is really easy to debug these tests because Cypress comes with two things. One, it has a great API or set of functions that you can use to debug your tests. And the second thing is that it integrates with popular development tools such as the Chrome Dev tools. So you can use it with Chrome Dev tools or Visual Studio Code as well. And then you can debug from breakpoint to breakpoint what is the value of a particular variable when you're running the test. And that is absolutely amazing. Now let's discuss what sets Cypress apart from other test runners, because we have other tools, right? So one of the really cool things about Cypress that I like is that it can work with a lot of browsers and all those browsers that you have installed within your machine. In the screenshot that you see on your screen is actually detecting what are the installed browsers, and then you can select one of those and then run on the particular browser to see how things work. There are other bunch of tools that I really like about Cypress that stands out. One thing is time travel, which means that you can actually travel back in time within Cypress to see each step that your test took, and then you can actually see what was the outcome of the particular test at a particular step. And we use that by looking at the command log. As I said, Cypress also gives you a really cool debugging option. So you can debug directly using the tools that we already have, which means that you won't be guessing why your tests failed. You can actually look into that and then fix them in real time. Then Cypress also has real-time reloads, which means that you don't have to essentially run Cypress every time or run a command every time. As soon as you change your test files, Cypress automatically reloads them and you see the output right away. One really cool thing about Cypress that I personally like a lot is automatic waiting. Consider that you have a call that takes a lot of time and you don't exactly know when your network call will finish with the data that you require, and you have a test that depends on that network call. Usually what we do is that we hard code a value of set timeout or something, or we put a timer in there. But Cypress actually makes it easier because it provides a certain way that you can tell it, and then it waits automatically for that network call to finish. And it's not just about network call, it's also about any timeouts that you want to put there. So it's really easy, and I'm going to show you how that works as well. All right, let's talk about time travel. This is a really cool snapshot that shows when you run a test, what do you see in the command log. So you can see that this is a test that we are going to run for this particular situation. And what we have here is that we have a list of messages, and then we try and adding another message. So we go to the input box, and then we type into the box, and then we expect that, hey, we should have another message added to the list. And then when we look at the snapshot, you see each step done one by one. You see that we get the message items. First, we expect that the items are 3, or we have 3 items in the list. Then we get the chat input, and we type hello world in it. And then we get the button, the send button, to create the message. And then we click on that message, or click on that button, which essentially creates the message and adds it to our list of messages. And then we expect in the test that the messages now should have been 5. So from 4 messages to 5 messages, this is what is happening. And if I show you the actual application, it looks something like this. So I can go here, and then I can say test. And then if I hit enter or click the send button, you see that we have now 5 messages. And that is what this particular test is actually testing. Now, as I mentioned, that Cypress also provides a lot of cool things for debuggability. For instance, if I wanted to see what is the value of the title of this particular application, I can use cy.title. But then to check the value, I can use the then method and put a debugger in there. What this would do is that it will stop the test at that particular point, which means that you should be able to now just hover over this selected element variable, and you should be able to see what is the value of the variable in real time. And this debugger is something that we as web developers already know, and some of us might be even using them in the development. Another way of debugging the value that comes out of a particular command, and we are going to talk about commands later, but when we put the debug method after a particular command, we actually can see what comes out of that command. And again, since we are using the debug method, we basically stop at a breakpoint, obviously not within the code because Cypress stops it at some point. But if you switch to your console, you should be able to see 3 things. One is, what is the command name? So as you can see in the previous snapshot, the command that we are debugging is the should command, right? So it says the command name is should, and then the arguments are, we are expecting the title of the browser to be ng Cypress starter, and then the current value of this variable, or the actual value, is also ng Cypress starter. And that's why this test will essentially pass, because we are getting the expected value. Now, let's talk about some more debugging capabilities. So as you can see, we have a command log in Cypress, and as you click on any of the command, even without using the debug method or putting the debugger, whenever you're running tests and the tests are completed, you can just go to the command log, click on a particular step, and on the console, Cypress automatically logs out the value out of it, which is amazing. So you can actually see what is the output of a particular command at a particular point, and you can predict what's going to happen when you're going to fix something or change something. Now let's talk about how you get started with Cypress. So it's really easy. If you have an Angular project, you will just do an npm install -d or -save-dev with Cypress and concurrently. We are using concurrently to just write a script that we can use to simultaneously start Cypress as well as your Angular project. So you don't have to run 2 commands in 2 different terminals or tabs. Once you are done with installing the packages, you basically update your package JSON with these 2 scripts. You write start Cypress, which essentially runs Cypress open. And then you have the Cypress test command, which runs concurrently with two things. It runs your Angular application, and then it runs the Cypress start command as well, which runs Cypress along with it. So once you have run it for the first time, Cypress does some magic in your project. It essentially creates two things. One, the Cypress folder, which contains all the E2E tests. And then it also creates a Cypress JSON. The Cypress JSON is used to configure Cypress according to your needs. Some of the things that we have in the JSON is we can ignore certain test files. So Cypress automatically creates this examples folder when you install it first time. So I'm ignoring it in my config. And then I'm setting the viewport height and viewport width of the Cypress window or the test runner window. And I'm going to show you the test runner window as well, which is this one. And if I open or if I run this test, then it's going to look something like this. But we are going to go back to that later. The important thing here is that we are using this base URL. And this is interesting because in the test, I want to say go to /messages or /chat. I don't want to say immediately like go to localhost 4200/chat. I don't want to do that. So that's why we are setting the base URL here. So in the tests, we can use relative URLs, which makes it easier and more cleaner. And then you can also use different configurations if you're running the test locally versus if you're running in the CI. So this file is super handy for that case. Now let's look at some of the Cypress commands and how we assert things or how we expect the values of certain variables. So the most basic command in Cypress is the visit command. So understand that for each test, Cypress has to visit a particular page, which means that if you have 5 tests, Cypress is going to reload the page 5 times because before each test, it visits the particular page, and then each test is run in isolation. So if you want to visit a page, you can give a relative URL if you have configured your Cypress JSON correctly. Similarly, I can give it, if I'm using the hash location strategy, I can give it a hash URL as well. As you can see that I'm going to a particular message detail page, which is something like this. Now, going forward, let's talk about how you get a particular element, because in the test, we were getting this particular input and then we added something to it, right? So to get a particular element, what you do is that you use the cy.get method and you provide the CSS selector here. So I'm using the ID here, but you can use essentially any query selector that you want. Another way of getting a particular element is using the contains method. But this contains method should be used with caution because this essentially gets all the elements which contain this word delete in the text node or in the text content as we developers know it. So if you have multiple elements that contain this word delete, then you'll get them all. So you have to be careful with this one. Now consider this use case. In this list of items, what we want to do is to click the 4th item, and then we want to check the URL that once we click this 4th item, the URL is localhost something something /message/3. How would that test look like in Cypress? So essentially, this is the use case. We click the 4th item and then we check the URL. Now in Cypress, what you would do is that you would basically create the it block, which is the test. And then inside, we get the selector or we get the item using the selector. Now cy.get basically gets a list of items and not just a particular item. So you can get the list of items and then we use the EQ3, which means that we are getting the 4th item out of this array that we just got in the previous step, and EQ starts from 0, so 3 is the 4th item. And then we click on that particular element. So essentially, we are getting the 4th item, and then we click on it. And then we check via the cy.url method, what is the current URL? And then we use the should method to kind of compare that with the EQ operator that, hey, the URL should be http localhost 4200/message/3. Now here you cannot exactly provide a relative URL. You might have to use some variables or configuration to kind of handle different environments, but just for the sake of information, you have to provide the full URL here and not just the relative URL. And this is the test for this particular case. When we run this test, we basically get this output. So you see that we got the message, then we used the EQ3, then we clicked the element, And this is the output that Cypress provides us, that when you clicked it, you got a new URL. And finally, we test that the current URL is expected is equal to the expected URL, and that's what's happening. So it essentially runs. Now consider another use case. We want to click the fourth item, then we want to click the delete button to delete the card, which is essentially this. So we click the fourth item, then we click this delete button from the detail view, and then we check the URL, and then we assert that the fourth item is now deleted. So look at this once again. There were 4 items, we deleted, and now there are 3 items. When writing with Cypress, this looks something like this. We are not writing this test in the chats spec.ts or spec.js. We're writing this test as of the message detail test. So in this particular file, we are visiting the message 3 page. So it essentially starts from here. So we are saying that, hey, start the test from here, then click the delete button, and then there should be 1 message removed. So if I try this again, it's something like this. It starts from here, delete, and now see that there should be 3 messages. So for this, what we do is that we check what is the selector of this delete button. And here we can see that in the DOM, the card has the class card, of course, 2 literal. And then for the button, we have the class btn and btn danger, but we also have the word delete. So I've used combination of both the cy.get and cy.contains to show you what happens here. So we are saying, hey, get the card, and there is only 1 card in the view, and then get the delete or get all the elements that contain delete word within them within the card. So it's finding the delete word or the element with the delete word within the card element and not outside of it. And then we click on that. So once we click, then we assert that the URL should have changed to the localhost 4200 chat. And then we check that, hey, now the message items list or the messages list should have only 3 items. And once we run this, we see that it runs as expected. So we get the element, we get the delete button, we click on it, the URL changes, we assert that the URL has changed, and then we also try to get the items list, and then we check that we have now 3 elements. I was also looking at the chat, but I think I'm going to look at that later. So consider this new use case. We want to add an item to the chat. So essentially, this is what we want to do. We type something and then it adds to the chat, which means that there were 4 items before and now there are 5 items. So essentially getting the text input, typing the new message, pressing the send button, and then asserting that now we have 5 items. In Cypress, it looks something like this as I've written it. So we first check that there are 4 items. Then we get the chat input. Then we type hello world in it. Then we get the send button and click on it. And then we check that the items should now be 5 instead of 4. And once we run this, everything looks good. Everything runs as we have discussed before, and you have a good test running. Now, you might be thinking that, hey, isn't this really simple and basic? I mean, this is the senior track, right? So where is the senior level content? Now let's talk about this particular use case, and we are going to go there. So in this particular case, we are going to test that you first hover over a particular item, and then you click the delete button, and then we assert that 1 item should have been removed. Pretty easy, right? So essentially, it should something like this, as I just showed you. And in terms of Cypress, what we would potentially do is that we'll first check the items should be 4. We should have 4 items or 4 messages. Then in order to get the third element, we are using the EQ2, since it starts with 0. And then we find the delete button selector within that, which should essentially find this button. And then we press click on it. And then we assert that, hey, this should be 3. Now, once we run this, this is the output that we would see. And this will actually result in failure. Now, you might be thinking, why doesn't it work? And the reason is that Cypress doesn't have a way to perform hover over a particular element. So that's why we get this error. And as you can see in the test as well, there's nothing on the right side that's happening. You're not hovering on anything. So the question is, what is the solution in this particular case? and that is using the force. I mean, it's always using the force. Well, this time it's literally, because in the click method, you can provide an object that says force true, which essentially clicks even the hidden elements. So even if they are not being displayed on the view, you can still click on them using this particular API. So essentially, in the click method, we would just add force true, and that should fix the issue for us. So as you can see, the test works right now. And on hovering, you see on the right side, we are able to click the delete button, and then we are able to see the item removed as well. Now, another thing that is really interesting with Cypress is that you can test forms, and I'm going to share with you some examples. So this is an example of testing forms. We're going to see some different things. For example, in this one, we provide an invalid value for the password, and we assert that the submit button in the end should be disabled. And you see that it is disabled in the end. So we basically wrote this particular test. Now, in another test, we assert that everything in the form is valid, and on submit, we should show an alert at the top. And you see that that's also working fine. So these are just some examples that you can play around with, and you can easily test different forms, writing really simple tests. Now, the important thing, or the technical thing that I really like about Cypress, which is waiting for the Exiture call using variable aliases. Now, consider the situation where you have a network call and then you have an assertion, but that fails because of some reason. So essentially what's happening in this particular situation is that we are waiting for, or we are typing this word iron in the search box, and then we expect that we should get only one result in the view instead of the whole list. So what we do is that we wait for the call, but then it fails. And then you see that in a later time, we get the response back and then it reflects. So Cypress exactly tells you what's happening. First, the problem is that we expected one item, but we got 10 items. That's why it says expected 10 to equal 1. And then it tells you why. Because Cypress waited for 4,000 milliseconds or 4 seconds to try this assertion, but it didn't work. And the reason for that is, if you look closely at the top message, we asserted first, and then we got the network request back here. And that's the problem here. So how do we tell Cypress to wait for longer? Maybe just hard code 6 seconds there or 10 seconds there. That's what we potentially would do. But Cypress actually provides us a better way of doing this. And that is by using variable aliases. So a variable alias is something that you can create with Cypress. And this is a really simple example in which we are creating an alias for a hard-coded string. So we have this value, hard-coded value 123, which is a string. And then we are creating this as a variable by using cy.wrap and then using the .as method. Once we have created the alias, we can use it further in the test. So we are saying, hey, cy.get my alias, and this is the syntax that you have to use. So you have to prefix the alias with the @ character, and then we are kind of asserting it that it should be this value. So we are using the same string, of course. So this test should pass. But imagine that we have another test in the same file and we are asserting the same thing. Would this work? No, this would not work, because the scope of this alias is only within this test and it will not be available into another test. And as we discussed, Cypress runs each test in complete isolation. So we need this alias to be available. The correct way of doing this alias, if we wanted to use it in both tests, would be to use it in a before each method. So here we are kind of defining it in the before each callback. And then we are using it in the first test, and then we are using it in the second test, and this essentially works perfectly fine. Now, back to the problem where we had this issue where it would fail after 4,000 milliseconds. So here, using the variable aliases, what we would do is that we would use the cy.intercept method to give a regex, sort of, or not a regex, but a wildcard URL in which we are saying, hey, any call to the API randomuser.me in this particular test should be considered as an alias, which is search users, right? And we know that in this test, we only search for a particular user, and that's why we are using the search user alias. And then further in the test, we start with typing in the search input. We type the word iron, and then we tell Cypress to wait for this search user alias. And that means that Cypress will start waiting for the search user alias and will keep waiting before it moves to the next step. So which means that Cypress will now wait for the network call to finish, and then it will assert whatever we want to assert. And we are asserting that after the call, we should only see one card, which is the searched user. So when we run this, the tests pass immediately. So see that now Cypress is going to wait a bit longer for the call, and now it's going to assert. And as you can see, all the tests pass because we didn't have to hard code anything. Now, the last technique that I'm going to focus on is using fixtures in Cypress. And by fixtures, we mean sort of mock data, and not just for network calls, but also for certain things that we get from the file system, or if we want to use something like the images or something, we can also mock them as well. So imagine this case where you have a lot of tests to work with, and each test is calling a particular API to get the data. Now, if it was your own server, that might be okay. I'm just saying might be because that may be wrong in your own server as well. But if it's a third-party API, then you might have issues with quota or costs, for instance, and you might want to just mock that data within your test to avoid doing actual API calls, right? So in order to do so, let's just consider that in the real world where we are not using any mock data, this is the result of the query that we do. So we send a user's query, or we hit an API to get the users, and this is the result that we get. Notice that we have an object that has the results key, and this results key contains an array of different users. Now, without Cypress fixtures, this is what our code looks like. We just do a cy.intercept and use a variable alias, and then we wait for search users, and then we assert it. But in case of fixtures, what you can do is that you can create a file within the fixtures folder. And here we are naming it users.json. Notice that the code syntax or the response or the JSON inside this file is exactly the same as the response that we were looking at. An object with the results key, and that contains an array of users. Now, when we use the fixtures, we use it by doing cy.fixture user.json, which basically goes into the fixtures folder and gets this file for you. But we are more interested in telling Cypress to use this data when the network call is done. So we do that by using the then method, where we get the actual JSON within this variable. We are calling it response for now. And then what we do is that we intercept the particular wildcard URL, and then we are telling Cypress that whenever this call is hit, use this response instead of making an actual call. So this response will be used directly from our fixture. And then we use the alias, and then we visit the user's page. Now this part is really interesting, because in Angular, when you load a page, then you potentially would be calling this particular situation in an ng-on init, right? Or maybe in a later time. Now we don't have any control of Angular in Cypress. So how do we tell Cypress to kind of make the fixture ready before the network call? So if your page calls it in the very beginning, then it's a really good idea to use fixture before even you visit the page. And that will make sure that the fixture is ready when your tests run. And then we use the cy.wait as usual, and then we assert, and then everything works fine. Now, finally, I would like to share some shameless plug. But even before that, I'm going to show you something here. So this is the example of the Cypress fixtures to sort of use the data, which is from the fixtures. And a really cool thing about here is not only the network calls that you see in the test would be fetched from the fixture. Let me quickly show you. So here, not only the network calls are being fetched from the fixture, but also each image that you see is also fetched from the fixture, because you might have certain use cases where even the images might cost you. So even mocking the images is also possible. And I'm doing that in this particular example in a really cool way, that I can't show you right now, but I can promise you that you can see it really, really soon. Now, about the shameless plug, the examples that I shared with the Cypress fixtures and some of the examples that we have seen with the waiting for Exiture calls and also some previous examples in this talk, they're actually from my Angular book that I've written, and I've took a lot of time writing it, about 8 to 9 months. And this book contains about 90 recipes that's not just revolving around Cypress, but also unit tests, performance improvements in Angular, reactive forms, and whatnot, even Angular CDK. So this book is available for pre-orders right now. It's not launched yet. It's going to be available, I believe, in July start or June end. But essentially, this is the link, bit.ly ng cookbook-snirs, and you got it. So yeah, check it out. Let me know how you feel about that. And just two things before we wrap up. Test your apps before your users so they don't end up in this particular situation. And yeah, if you have a dog and if you like snowboarding, don't take your dog there because you might end up in a situation like this, which might be happy and sad at the same time. Who knows? Thank you everyone for having me today. You can follow me on my Twitter. Do so you are updated with what I'm doing, or you can go to my GitHub and follow there as well. I have a lot of Angular libraries that a lot of people use actually.